Imagine a company so powerful, it had its own army, its own navy, its own prisons, its own courts, its own currency, a company that could declare war on sovereign nations, sign peace treaties, execute criminals, enslave entire populations. Not a government, not an empire, a company, one single company that changed the course of history for hundreds of millions of people across 3 continents. A company that made some of the richest men in the world and destroyed entire peoples in the process. The Dutch East India Company, known as the VOC, was the most powerful corporation in the history of the world. At its peak, it was worth more than Apple, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and every other major company today combined. And most people have never heard the full story of what it did. Welcome to Mielmobiel. Today we tell the story of the VOC, the company that conquered the world and the price that was paid for it. To understand the VOC, you need to understand the world in the late 1500s. Europe was obsessed with spices, not just as food. Spices were power: black pepper, nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon. These were worth more than gold. They preserved food. They masked the smell of rotting meat. They were status symbols for the wealthy. And they all came from one place: the Spice Islands. A tiny chain of islands in what is now Indonesia, on the other side of the world. For decades, Portugal had controlled the spice trade. They had the ships, the routes, the monopoly, and they charged whatever they wanted. Every gram of pepper that reached Europe had passed through Portuguese hands and Portuguese profits. The Dutch were furious. They were one of the greatest trading nations in Europe. They refused to be controlled by anyone. Something had to change. In 1602, the Dutch government had an idea. Instead of competing with each other, sending separate ships, losing money, getting destroyed by Portuguese warships, why not combine forces? On March 20th, 1602, the VOC was born. 6 Dutch trading companies merged into one. The government gave them something extraordinary: a monopoly, the exclusive right to trade in all of Asia. No other Dutch company was allowed to compete, but that was just the beginning. The VOC was given powers that no company before or since has ever had: the legal right to build forts, maintain armies, fight wars, make treaties with foreign rulers, govern territories. It was not just a company, it was a state within a state, a government with shareholders, an empire with a balance sheet, and it was about to change the world. The VOC moved fast. Within years, Dutch ships were sailing across the globe, around Africa, across the Indian Ocean, to India, Japan, China, Persia, and the Spice Islands. Wherever they went, they did not just trade, they conquered. The architect of this conquest was a man named Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, the VOC's most powerful governor in Asia. A man of iron will, ruthless ambition, and absolutely no mercy. Cohen believed one thing completely: the spice trade could only be controlled through violence and fear. He wrote to his superiors in Amsterdam that there was no trade without war, and no war without trade. The two were inseparable in his mind, and he acted on that belief without hesitation. In 1621, he proved it. The Banda Islands were the only place in the world where nutmeg grew. The local people, the Bandanese, had traded spices for centuries with many different nations. They refused to give the VOC an exclusive monopoly. Cohen's response was swift and devastating. He sent VOC soldiers and Japanese mercenaries to the islands. What followed was a massacre. The Bandanese population of around 15,000 people was almost completely wiped out, murdered, starved, enslaved, driven into the jungle to die. When it was over, fewer than 1,000 Bandanese remained. The VOC then imported Dutch settlers and enslaved workers to run the nutmeg plantations. The Spice Islands were now theirs, completely permanently, and the profits were enormous. By the mid-1600s, the VOC was unstoppable. It controlled trading posts and territories across an area stretching from South Africa to Japan. It had over 50,000 employees, 40 warships, 150 merchant vessels, and a private army of tens of thousands of soldiers. Its headquarters in Asia was a city called Batavia, built from scratch on the island of Java in what is now Jakarta, Indonesia. Today, that city is home to over 10 million people. But back then, it was built by VOC hands with VOC money, on land taken by VOC force. Batavia was a Dutch city transplanted to the tropics. Canals just like Amsterdam, brick buildings, churches, a stock exchange where merchants traded commodities from across Asia, and surrounding it all, the VOC's imposing forts and guns pointed outward at anyone who dared challenge their authority. The city became the beating heart of an Asian empire. Every ship that sailed for the VOC passed through Batavia. Every order, every decision, every shipment of spices flowed through this one city on the edge of the jungle. The VOC had a simple strategy everywhere it went. Find the most valuable resource, eliminate the competition, control the supply completely, charge whatever price you want. In Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, they seized control of the cinnamon trade, overthrowing the local kingdom that had ruled for centuries. In India, they established trading posts and fought wars against local rulers and European rivals alike. In Persia, they traded silk and ceramics. In China, they bought porcelain and tea. And in Japan, a country that had closed itself off from almost all foreign contact, the VOC was the only Western nation allowed to trade. Operating from a tiny artificial island called Dejima in Nagasaki Harbor, completely isolated from Japanese society, Dutch traders lived under strict rules for over 200 years, just to maintain access to Japanese markets. The VOC was everywhere, and it answered to no one. Not to foreign kings, not to local rulers, not even fully to the Dutch government. It operated by its own rules, for its own profit. At its absolute peak in 1637, a single VOC share was worth the equivalent of millions of dollars in today's money. Investors across Europe were desperate to own a piece of the most profitable company in history. But behind the profits, behind the dividends paid to Dutch shareholders, sitting comfortably in Amsterdam, was an empire built on violence, slavery, and terror. The VOC enslaved hundreds of thousands of people across Asia and Africa. Enslaved workers built their forts, harvested their spices, sailed their ships, worked their plantations from sunrise to sunset under the threat of violence. Those who resisted were punished brutally and publicly. Those who tried to trade spices with anyone other than the VOC faced death, not fines, death. On the Banda Islands, VOC soldiers would cut down nutmeg trees that belonged to local people, not to harvest them, simply to destroy them, to make sure no one else could profit. In parts of Indonesia, the VOC introduced a system called the contingenten, forced deliveries. Local farmers were required to give a fixed amount of their harvest to the VOC every year, for free, as tribute, as submission. Those who could not deliver were punished, villages burned, people enslaved. The VOC did not just trade with Asia, it bled Asia dry, and for nearly 200 years, it got away with it. But nothing lasts forever. By the late 1700s, the VOC was crumbling. Corruption had eaten it from the inside. Employees stole from the company. Wars had drained its resources. Competition from Britain and France had eroded its monopoly. On December 31st, 1799, the VOC was officially dissolved after 197 years of operation, one of the longest-running and most powerful corporations in human history, quietly wound down by paperwork and debt. Its debts, enormous debts accumulated through decades of corruption and war, were taken over by the Dutch government. Its territories became official Dutch colonies, which would remain under Dutch control for another 150 years. The people of Indonesia did not gain full independence until 1949. Nearly 350 years after the VOC first arrived, the VOC was gone. But its legacy remained, deep and lasting and painful. In the countries it had exploited for centuries, in the cultures it had disrupted and destroyed, in the languages, the borders, the economic systems it had left behind, in the millions of lives it had crushed in pursuit of profit. The Netherlands grew rich, built its golden age, became one of the wealthiest nations in Europe. And the people of Asia paid for it. The VOC was the most powerful company in history, and it used that power to show the world exactly what happens when greed has no limits. This was the story of the VOC. Subscribe to Mielmobiel. Many more forgotten stories just like this one are still coming out.